Hello. Okay, welcome everyone. Okay. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Rabbi.
Afternoon. Good afternoon. Just gonna check one thing. I want to see if I put it on two Facebooks, if it's still working. Yeah. Okay. Good. So let us bring up the parsha. Okay. We'll be on in 1 second. So we now begin taking a deep dive into the life of Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay, so yesterday, share screen. Okay, there we are. So yesterday we made the acquaintance of Moshe Rabbeinu. They decreed to throw all the kids in the river, the boys in the river, and Moshe is found by Paro's daughter. We all know the story. So Vayi b'yomim mohem, and it was those days. Vayigdal Moshe. Moshe grew up. The general consensus is that he was 20 at the time. Vayetzi Elocha, he went out to his brothers. So as we discussed this morning, how did we know that it was his brothers? He knew it was his brothers because Yocheved had nursed him. And Moshe, being a precocious child, by the time she finished nursing him, he already knew who he was and where he came from and so on. And he saw in their troubles. But Yarish Mitzri Make Ish Ivri Me'echav. And he saw a Mitzri hitting an Ivri from his brother. So Moshe already saw the Mitzri as a stranger, and and this person as his brother. So Vayif and Kovako, he turned this way and that, and he saw there was no one there, and he hit the Mitzri, and he hit him in the in the sand. So on Vayif and Kovako, so Rashi says, besides the plain meaning, it indicates that he looked to see if anyone worthwhile would be descended from this person if he continued to live. Seeing that this wasn't the case, he smote him. The idea being that even though he was murderously striking his fellow Jew, he still nevertheless wanted to make sure that this was divine providence. He goes out, I guess he was still in the palace on the second day, and there's two Hebrews fighting. He said to the wicked person, why are you hitting your fellow? By tradition, this is Datan and Aviram, the troublemakers throughout their sojourn in the desert. And he says, who made you a chief and ruler over us? Do you mean to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? And Moshe was frightened and said, then the matter is known. So Rashi says that it's a strange formulation. What's the matter? So Rashi says that he says, I was wondering why the exile was so harsh. And now I know, because there are people who are both willing to fight with each other and slander their fellow Jew, e.g. me, to Pharaoh. V'yishma Paro Esadara, Pharaoh heard of it, presumably from these two gentlemen, and he sought to kill Moshe. Yivrach Moshe mipnei Paro v'yeshav eretz Midyan v'yeshav ala be'er. So he arrived in the land of Midian, and he sat down besides a well. Generally speaking, you want to know what's going on. You sit down by the well because everyone needs to come to the well, and also it was time for him to find a match. And Eliezer found a match for Yitzchak by the well, and Yaakov found Rachel by the well. So he came and sat down by the well. And now, however, you see that Moshe gets married. He has children. Presumably, you get married, you have children pretty quickly. And so when he has his first two children, it has to be pretty close to his marriage. And if he has these children close to his marriage, that means that since the second child is born and has a bris on the way into Egypt, as we'll learn later, so that follows that the marriage was close to going to Egypt. But this creates a chronological problem, because Moshe is 80 years old when he stands before Pharaoh. So this whole process of getting married and having the kids, since it doesn't say that she was barren or anything, the other matrix, talking maybe 5 years. So Moshe gets married at 75, and he leaves as a grown-up, the standard time for growing up is not more than 20. So there are essentially 55 years unaccounted for in Moshe's life. And there are various midrashim about this, some very interesting ones. But essentially, when Moshe ran away from Pharaoh, he didn't end up in Midian. It says that he ran away to the south, and he ended up in Ethiopia, or as the Sudan. And he was there for many years, and there are a lot of stories, there are a lot of midrashim about what precisely happened there. And after he figured that Pharaoh, that there was already a new Pharaoh, and it's 60 years or so, 50 years or so, he headed to Midian. The Midianites live, they're nomads, more or less, and they live in what's today southwestern Jordan, but also into the northwestern corner of Saudi Arabia that's connected to Jordan. So that's the area that they lived. So presumably he crossed the Gulf of Suez, which is between Asia and Africa, and up in the land of the Midianites, who are, of course, descendants of Abraham. So so if we're going to look at Midrashim, we should look at this. So L'koi Midian Sheva Bana. Midian, the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flocks. But the shepherds came and drove off. Moses rose to the defense and watered their flock. So they came to rule. They said, how does he come back so soon today? So the Egyptian rested us from the shepherds. He watered for us and watered them. So in other words, because so the question is, why is Yisro was described as the priest of Midian? Why is such an important person sending his daughters to water the flock? Usually you'd hire people. So the answer given is that is, you know that God is, when he comes to see Moses, I know God is greater than all the other gods, right? So he had, so Midrash says he had worshipped every single god that he knew of. Finally decided they were all baloney and began worshiping the one God. So his people ostracized him, and no one would work for him, nor would they let his daughters draw water. So they never were able to draw water until everyone left. And that's the background. Now, there is a very interesting midrash as to which puts a lot of biblical stories together in one basket, which describes how did Yisro end up in trouble. So it says, Pharaoh of Egypt, who had a big empire, advisors from all over the world. And he had Bilam from Syria. He had Eov, Job, who appears in the book of Job later, from Israel, from Canaan. And he had Yitro from Arabia. These were wise people who he had gathered from the outer reaches of the Egyptian empire, because all these places at that time were in the orbit of Egypt. So the Medrash goes on to say that when he decided, remember the harsh slave labor only ends 6 years before his birth, at the birth of Miriam. That's why she's called Miriam Bitter. And the throwing in the water decree begins at the time of Moses' birth, a few months before. So Yitro was young then and old by the time this story. Yitro was one of the advisors, and Pharaoh turned to his advisors, to Job, to Bilam, who we meet later in Parshas Balak, and Yitro, and asked them, how should I deceive the Jews? So Bilam said, well, their gods to have a lot of power over on, so drown them in the water, because all the people got Pharaoh in trouble, and if he met in trouble, it was always in land, so throw them in the water. Yitro says, you know what, I don't think their God is limited to the land, and everyone who started up with the children of Abraham has gotten into trouble. The 4 kings who started up with Abraham got into trouble, and Nimrod got into trouble, Pharaoh got into trouble, and Avimelech got into trouble, and after Yaakov's children killed the people of Shechem, able to touch them. So I would advise you not to mess around with the Jews. It's a bad idea to stop with the Jewish people. They weren't called Jewish, but anyways. And Eov was silent. So the Medrash says that Bilam, who gave murder advice to Pharaoh, was ultimately destroyed in this world and the next by Moshe, who was saved from his plan. And Yitro, who spoke up for defending the Jews, was rewarded that he became the father-in-law of Moses and the father-in-law of Pinchas, the father-in-law of Elazar, of Pinchas's father, and the Parsha, the Torah, is named after him, and the Torah wasn't given until he showed up, and so on. So Yitro was given many great rewards in this world and the next. Eov sheshatak nityasar. Eov, who was silent, was made to suffer, as the book of Job tells us, which is interesting because generally speaking, the whole point of the book of Job is that we don't know why people have suffering. But in this case, Job didn't know why, but God knew why. And though Job ultimately has a portion in the world to come. Now, this brings us to Moshe's staff. So there's a beautiful medrash which describes how God gave Adam Harishon a staff, and in the staff was hinted all the history of the world and the 10 plagues and many other secrets were engraved. It was a staff made, as were the luchot, as the tablets were, of solid sapphire. And this staff was given, was passed down from generation to generation. And Shem to Aver, and Aver gave it to Abraham, and Abraham to Isaac, and Isaac to Jacob, and Jacob gave it to Yosef, who was his chosen successor as the leader of Am Yisrael. And Joseph, when he died, the new Pharaoh had it placed in his treasure houses. When Yitro had to flee from Pharaoh because Pharaoh wanted to kill him for arguing against him about hurting the Jews, Yitro decided this was a nice thing to have, and he swiped it, and he took it home, and he placed it in his garden. And this is where I mentioned this morning that the whole King Arthur story is stolen from the Medrash. So with Excalibur, with the sword, so he stuck it in the ground, and he had many people who wanted to marry his eldest daughter, Tzipora. So he said, anyone who can pull the stick out of the ground, says the Medrash, could marry her, but no one could pull it out of the ground. So Moshe Rabbeinu came along, and he says, you look like a nice fellow. How would you like to marry my daughter? Moshe says, well, why not? It's a relative. It's a descendant of Avram, right? But he says this one thing: you have to go get the staff. So Moshe went to the staff, and it just jumped into his hand. It came out easily. So we understood that Moshe went to the staff, and this is the staff that turned into a snake. This is the staff that all the miracles were done with, and so on. And supposedly, it's one of the things that are hidden with various other things from the first temple that deep under the Temple Mount that were restored when Mashiach comes. What exactly we learn from this has to do with continuity and other things. Maybe we'll explore it a little bit more when we learn in the next parsha, and later in the parsha and the next parsha, about Moshe and his staff. Va'era. Next week we learn a lot about the staff. Okay, we are at 12:46. Anyone have any questions before we sign out?
Yes, I had a question,
Sure.
Rabbi. The person who was being beaten, was that one of the guys that was fighting the next day?
No. By tradition, there's a whole story with Shlomit Bat Dibri. There's a whole story behind there too, which will, essentially he had coveted. This is the only time this happened. It said there was one of the wives of the Israelites who this Egyptian wanted to sleep with, but she wouldn't sleep with him. So she woke up her husband early to do some task when it was dark, didn't have artificial light, and he went in and slept with her. When the husband realized what had happened, in order that it not become a tumult among the slaves, he started hitting him with the hope of killing him, and that's where Moses comes in. It's another medrash, but that connects later with another story in Bamidbar. So he was he was trying to kill him, to silence him, as if it were, and that's where the story comes in. But this, according to the medrash. Otherwise, if we take the plain meaning of the text, it was a random Jew, but it wasn't one of those. No, they're the ones they were arguing. They were arguing with each other, and apparently they were like the assistants in the jail. They were privileged characters, because later Rashi tells us how. They told Moshe, the people who want to destroy you have died. They didn't really die, it says in Rashi, but they had lost their wealth, their privilege. So these people must have been people who were collaborating with the Egyptians. And that's why Moshe says, now I know that there's Jews who are willing to speak ill of their fellow Jews and collaborate with the Egyptians, and that's why the exile is so harsh.
So how did they find out, Rabbi? Did the person who almost got killed speak up?
No, you know what, mate? My guess is that other people saw, but none of the other Jews was going to speak up to the Egyptians except these guys. because Rashi says Rishoyim Delturin. Delturin are informers. It's a corruption of a Latin word that means informers. I believe it comes from the same root as deleterious. Okay. As a matter of fact, if I type it in to the Google, if I type it into the Google thingy, here. Deltor. Okay. So it comes from the Latin, and it's a Latin, and it means to testify. It means to tell someone who sinned. And it deltor anilach, so it's deleterious. It comes from the root of the Latin root of deleterious. Snitch, very good. Yes, a snitch, precisely. Thank you, Sheila. But it comes from the Latin root that becomes the word deleterious in English. Okay, so yeah, and it's a term used in the Talmud for informers. That's why it appears in Rashi. Okay, have a great day, everyone. Thank you for joining us, whether you were with us on Zoom or Facebook or YouTube. Thank you all for coming. All the best. Bye.
Thank you, Rav. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and yeah, well, we're on Thursday for the morning and the afternoon, and tonight we do the Haftarah. All the best.